just start recording now. Right, so welcome everybody. We're going to talk about the Wellbeing for Education Return project. And as a very quick starting point, I'm just going to give you an overview of the project to remind you or tell you for the first time about the different parts of the project. So Wellbeing for Education Return is a national Department for Education funded project. And in this region, the Nottinghamshire and Nottingham City have joined up together to work together. So we've got some funding to support well-being and the return to school, basically. And what we're doing is we're delivering training for mental health leads in schools and education settings. There's a two-part webinar. So part one focused on resilience and recovery at a whole school or whole organisation level. And at the end of that webinar, we asked people what they would like us to focus on in webinar two. So the most popular request was anxiety and low mood as well. So we're going to look at that. So we're going to talk about today individual needs and local networks. So individual needs around anxiety and low mood and what local networks are out there to support you. So all of the resources, number two on this list here, all of the resources that I'm going to talk about today are on the project website. So everything, the recordings, the slides, and you can download this presentation and use in your school. So if you're doing staff meeting around staff wellbeing, sessions with parents, if you're working with young people in tutor time or small group sessions, you can use all of this content. So this is all the training that's happening. This will all be completed by the end of this week, and it's been happening this term. The other thing that we're doing is we're developing a local offer website for mental health support across Nottingham City and Nottinghamshire. And what that means is we're going to have one website where anyone in Nottingham City or County can go to find out information and services around mental health for children and young people and adults. So it'll be a directory similar to the local offer, but it'll work across this city and county. And what we're doing in terms of the delivery of these webinars is developing local networks for mental health leads. So a range of different services have been involved in developing the training for today. And at the end, we're going to be sharing links to all the services, people who can work with you in the area of mental health. Okay, so that's the bigger picture. And what we're doing today is, this is the website, just to show you this first. Absolutely everything is on there and it's open access. So you can send this link to other people who haven't signed up to this webinar and they can access the content. Okay, so what we're doing today, we're focusing on anxiety and low mood. So what I'm going to do is introduce some key messages from the Wellbeing for Education Return project. And we're going to then talk about the psychology of anxiety and low mood, how we understand it and how we can help other adults and young people who are experiencing these things to understand what's happening. And then we're going to give you a toolkit of things that you can use one-to-one, small group, to support people who are experiencing anxiety or feeling low. So in terms of where we are all today, I'm just going to recognise that we were all working virtually, and this can be a sensitive topic. So just look after yourselves, share with care any examples. If you need to pop out, if you need to take a minute, do what you need to do. Keep in touch with myself on the chat. My colleague Tracy is just there as well if you have any questions, and also Rachel is on the chat if you have any IT issues. She has all the answers, don't you, Rachel? So look after yourselves, and as we're talking in discussions, just remember that we're all from different services. So if you're sharing stories or examples, think about confidentiality. And a key message that we're going to be talking about today is the difference in people's experiences. So we're going to talk about respecting and valuing difference and diversity, in particular in people's experiences, around well-being in the COVID context. My colleague shared a lovely metaphor with me. She said that COVID is like a storm, and we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. And everybody's boats are very different. And there's been a wide range of experiences, hasn't there? And so hopefully as we go through the day, we'll get lots of discussion and examples and content from you talking about different experiences. Okay, do my time check. Right, so let me first introduce you to some of the key ideas from this project. And these are basically some of the key messages that we want to share with schools and education settings. But actually, what we're finding as we go through these webinars is that we're reminding staff of these things. So many schools do this really well already. So it's reminding you of, what you do well and reminding you to keep doing it in the current context. So I forgot to say actually that the way we're delivering these webinars is we're delivering them at a district level. So there's 7 webinars on this week in different districts. And then today we're delivering specifically for secondary and college staff or people who work with children in secondary school or colleges. Okay, so these are the key messages. And the key thing to remember is that the messages apply to adults as well as students. And actually in some schools, what people are telling us is that the adults are struggling at the moment more than the students. And some students are, they're excited. They've been looking forward to getting back to school. They're seeing their friends. They're doing okay. The routines of school help them. But actually, the staff are struggling with workload and uncertainty. So all of the things we're talking about today apply to adults as well as students. And in some cases, the adults are the people that need support. So interesting if you guys have any reflections on that in your schools, how your staff are doing, how your students are doing overall. Please do share any reflections on the chat. Okay, so key messages to remind ourselves that the pandemic has had an impact on everyone, but it's been different for everybody. And the full range of experiences has gone from traumatic experiences, for example, some families have experienced sudden loss and bereavement, all the way up to children who are excited and looking forward to going back to school and they're doing well. So there's a wide range of experiences and we're reminding ourselves to have care and compassion for each other and ourselves. And the model that we are presenting, which underpins the Wellbeing for Education Return project. So this is something that was developed in Nottingham and then became part of the National Wellbeing for Education Return project, which is, exciting, but also really, really great that what we're doing in Nottingham is based on research. So these are the 5 key principles of recovery. And these principles are in no particular order. Often they work together, and really it's about the foundations that we need to be working on. So the first is reminding us to put emotional well-being first for everyone, to reaffirm our strengths and core values in schools and other organisations. So in times of trauma, we often find that people feel lost or confused and disconnected from who they are and their identity. So things we can do to reaffirm our strengths and our core values. Place relationships front and centre. Work really hard. Lots of the situation at the moment mean that our relationships are disjointed, even the fact that we're working virtually today. So we need to work really hard to put relationships front and centre. Reaffirm safety and routines, and that is something that schools, colleges, alternative provisions are working so hard on at the moment. And I know lots of you will be having lots and lots of conversations with your colleagues about your safety, your routines. And also to acknowledge loss, change and bereavement. And loss in its very broadest sense. So not just children who have experienced bereavement in their family, but also loss of opportunity, loss of routines and loss of connections. Okay, any reflections on, so I'll just pop the chat up for a moment, any reflections on the principles? Do these principles make sense to you? Any examples of things that have been working well in your schools or organisations where these principles have been applied? I'll give you a minute to pop any examples on the chat. Anyone who's been working in schools where you've been using these principles, any examples that you want to share or any comments? I know in our service, in the psychology service, we've been working hard on our relationships with each other because we're not seeing each other. And in between work, we've been having virtual coffee breaks. So we've just been having, a half an hour Teams meeting, which is a chance for people to just check in, to chat and have a coffee together. Yeah, Alison, you're recognising as well that resilience among school staff is low. Absolutely. Your comments are coming in now. One of the things, Alison, for sure around staff wellbeing is that staff who are working in bubbles are missing those small chances to connect with each other, aren't they? Because they're not, for example, some schools don't have access to their staff room. Yes. Yeah. And Bev, you're talking about the importance of consistency. Yeah. And, you know, the fact that school is there for children is a really key factor at the moment, isn't it? You know, that routine of school, although it's different and it's always changing, at least it's there in some form. Lovely. Oh, thanks very much for your reflections. Lovely. So Joe, you're talking about, you know, making a safe space for pupils to come and talk. And, you know, again, having that trusted adult is the importance of that relationship. Absolutely. And maybe within that safe space, Joe, you might have pupils who might acknowledge loss and change that is happening for them. And Suzanne, recognizing this model makes sense to you. That's good. Yeah. And within that, absolutely, bringing positivity and bringing hope. And that is leading us on to some research that tells us the best predictors of growth and recovery from difficult events. Exactly the things that you have been sharing are working. So this research is working with people who've experienced traumatic events and studying what are the best predictors of growth and recovery. The first is connectedness and relationships. So that safe space, you know, having those hopeful, positive connections with young people. The second is flexible coping skills. And exactly like one of you was just talking about, the fact that things are changing on a daily basis. We really need flexible coping skills at the moment, don't we? We need to do one thing to cope on one day and a different thing on another day. So we're going to talk today about some coping skills strategies that you can use with young people and adults that you're supporting. And we might think about how we need to be flexible in their use. And the third is interesting, a sense of agency and control. And actually there's so much in the current context that we can't control, that we don't have a sense of agency and that we don't have a say in. So wherever we can find and understand the things we can control and focus on them as opposed to the things we can't control, you know, that's going to help us with our growth and recovery. And interesting to explore that. I guess the key thing to notice is that the nature of the current situation makes these factors difficult to create, doesn't it? It's impacting on our ability to connect, you know, and it's impacting on our sense of control. So for anyone experiencing things like anxiety and low mood at the moment, it's completely understandable. And that's a really important message to remind ourselves as adults in schools and education settings, to remind the young people that we're working with, and also to remind the parents and carers. So that leads us on to focus more specifically on the psychology of anxiety and low mood. And so what I think I'll do is I will share with you some ideas from psychology, and then again I'll ask you for your thoughts and your reflections on the chat. But as we go through, if you have any comments, feel free to make them, even as they occur to you. Okay, so within our principles of recovery and our idea that we need to think about connectedness, coping, and thinking about sense of agency and control, let's first explore the psychology of anxiety and low mood. So what I was talking about previously, that everyone is experiencing anxiety and low mood at the moment, and understandably so. That's true for, you know, the real world. Anxiety and low mood are part of human experience. So they're not something that we can take away when we support children and adults who are experiencing them. It's more about understanding what's happening to you, giving it a name, talking about it, and being able to cope with it. So actually, if we look at our curve of the general population, most of us are in the middle there, having moderate mental health, you know, daily challenges, getting on with it. And then we have times in our lives where we're flourishing, and we have times in our lives where we experience poor mental health. But actually, challenges, you know, low levels of anxiety, for example, if we've got a deadline or we've got a bit of pressure, it's part of normal human experience. And that's a key message, particularly to share with young people who are just learning about anxiety. So it's all about understanding that this is normal. It happens to everybody. For some people, it happens more so than others. And if it's really big for you at the moment, anxiety, we're going to talk about how you can understand it and help to make it more manageable. Okay, so that's the first key idea. Next, we think about defining anxiety and low mood. What are we talking about? So anxiety usually has fear and avoidance of the feared thing at its core. So if you think about people that you are supporting at the moment who are feeling anxious, you might notice that they are experiencing fear, and you might notice them avoiding the thing that's feared. Whereas low mood or depression usually has loss, demotivation, and rumination at its core. So when we think about rumination in terms of low mood, that's lots of overthinking and focusing on negative thoughts. Okay, so anxiety and low mood are different, but they very often co-occur. So we're going to talk today as if they're very neat boxes, and we're going to talk about what they are, how they're different. But in the real world, you may know from your work that anxiety and low mood are often meshed together, and actually it's more of a mess, and people can feel both at the same time and different ones on different days. Okay, so what I'm going to share with you is a couple of slides from a presentation for young people for key stages 3 to 5, and you can download the pupil friendly version of this from the project website. Rachel popped it in the chat earlier. So the first thing that we always recommend is to teach young people about anxiety. Tell them what it is, what's happening to them, because it's a normal, healthy human emotion, but it can become an issue if it is constant or overwhelming. And for children who don't understand what's happening when they experience anxiety, this can be overwhelming and frightening. So in terms of this presentation, you can share with young people. We had someone in the webinar yesterday who also talked about potentially sharing some of this content with parents and carers to help them understand what's happening to their children if they're experiencing anxiety. So when we think about anxiety, we need to know that it impacts on our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviour. And then we need to learn what thoughts, feelings, and behaviours we have linked to anxiety. And we also need to learn that anxiety can be different for different people. And that's quite important that children start to learn, what are their triggers for anxiety and how does their body experience anxiety. The reason that we need to really reinforce the message that anxiety is normal is that actually anxiety can be useful. So the reason we experience anxiety is that it's all about keeping us alive. So it's a stress response that dates back to prehistoric times when you had to run fast to catch your food or to avoid being chased by wild animals. So the fight or flight response that we experience or freeze when we're anxious, if we're in a dangerous situation, if a lion is chasing us, that helps us to survive. It tells us something is wrong, we need to move. But sometimes what happens is we might be physically safe, we might be in a classroom, but our body is still having that stress response, and it might feel exactly the same as if a lion is chasing us. So it's all about learning to sort of retune our responses. Now there's a really good video I'm going to share with you, which comes from Anxiety Canada, and they have developed a primary and a secondary video with animation explaining anxiety to children. So it might be really good to share with young people and then have a discussion, and I'm going to share with you the secondary one. Okay.
You know what anxiety feels like. We all do. Everyone experiences anxiety in some way or another. It's something that connects all of us together. Why we feel anxiety and what it really is, that may surprise you. Without anxiety, we'd all be in serious trouble. As soon as your brain senses you're in danger, a little piece of it, called the amygdala, kicks in. It gets your body ready to react. That could mean fight, run away, or shut down. It's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. This reaction goes back millions of years to our distant animal ancestors. Animals whose amygdalae were more sensitive to danger were more likely to stay alive and off the menu. Over millions of generations, this developed into the system we all know as anxiety. So you see, anxiety itself is not all bad. But when there's no immediate life or death threat, and your amygdala keeps telling your body that you're in danger, that's when anxiety becomes a problem. Your amygdala doesn't know the difference between getting eaten and public speaking or failing a test. Human society has only existed for a relatively short time. It's messy and complicated and confusing, and our amygdalae just haven't had time to catch up. So sometimes, when we're in uncomfortable situations, our brains misread the risk and overreact. Our hearts beat faster and we breathe heavily, pulling more oxygen into our bodies. The muscles in our arms and legs tense up and fill with blood. Our skin perspires to cool us down. This would all be great if we needed to fight or run, but instead, we just feel tense and sweaty. Sometimes our minds go blank and we feel like we can't move or talk. That would be great if we needed to hide. Instead, we just feel stuck. When things trigger our anxiety, sometimes we try to avoid them, like our ancestors avoiding a predator. But that can cause problems when those triggers are important parts of life, like going to school or meeting new people, things that won't just give up and go away. So how does knowing all this help? Well, it starts with remembering what's really going on. There's nothing physically wrong with you. It's just your amygdala trying to tell you it thinks you're in danger, even if it gets confused about how much danger you're really in. Understanding why we feel anxiety is an important step in learning to manage it.
Okay. Do people want to share their reflections on that video in the chat? If you think it would be useful, or any examples of situations where you think you might be able to use it. What do you think? Do you think teenagers will be able to access it? Understandable? Yeah, absolutely. There's a strange pause when people are typing. I'm just waiting in suspense to hear what your comments are. Absolutely. So teaching children about emotions and teaching that the anxiety is normal and there's no physical thing wrong with you. You're not physically ill. Absolutely, because it might feel like that, particularly if children are having, you know, psychosomatic symptoms like feeling sick, a headache, you know, achy muscles. It really can feel like they're ill. And the physiological response can be so strong. Okay. So, oh, there was another comment there that I wanted to pick up on. Lovely. Yeah. So people are finding it accessible. That's great. Yeah. And understanding that it's part of life is so important. It's really important, isn't it? Because lots of children start to think, oh, I need to get rid of this anxiety. I need to avoid it altogether. And actually, that's not what we're talking about. And it's quite important for children to understand that. Another really useful analogy that we sometimes use is the idea of a smoke alarm. So thinking of anxiety like a smoke alarm. And so you need a smoke alarm in your house. If there's a fire and everyone's in danger, the smoke alarm will go off and you'll be safe. However, if the smoke alarm is above the toaster, the smoke alarm is going to go off even if there's just toast burning and there's no real danger. So we need anxiety, but we need sometimes, for some children and for some adults, we need to move it away from the toaster and maybe put it in the hall. So we don't want our anxiety smoke alarm going off if you know, someone just looks at us funny. But we want it to go off if we're in danger and we need to get out of a situation. So for lots of children, it's about moving the smoke alarm. So you still need your smoke alarm, but we need to move it. Okay. So in terms of low mood, we just want to introduce you to a model from a writer called Johann Hari. So let me tell you about it and then tell me if you think it makes sense and if you've noticed things linked to this happening in your schools and your organizations. So Johann Hari is a journalist and he personally has experienced depression since he was a teenager. He's written this book where he has explored all the different causes of low mood, not just genetic and biological. So biological treatments for depression, such as medication, are very common. And Johann Hari himself was prescribed medication as a teenager, but his low mood persisted and he just kept getting more higher doses, but things weren't improving for him. So he started exploring, talking to professors and researchers around the world. And he has written this book to raise awareness of the different social causes of low mood, and also the research behind how if we can reconnect with these things, there is evidence that these are as effective and in some cases more effective than medication in the treatment of low mood. So the things that cause low mood are when we become disconnected from these 9 things. And actually, I think it's really powerful to reflect on how the COVID situation has meant that we are disconnected from lots of these things. So we've become disconnected from other people. We're not able to see, our families, our work colleagues in real life. Some people have become disconnected from the natural world. If they're not, if we've got people who are clinically vulnerable, they're not getting out of the house. For some people, their work doesn't feel meaningful because they're just working virtually, or they're not able to work. They might have lost their jobs. For some people, they've been disconnected from a hopeful future. The future can look very uncertain currently. So I guess this model shows us that it's understandable if young people, adults are feeling low at the moment, because the current context has disconnected us from these things. What do people think of this model? Does it make sense to you? Have you noticed any of these factors in particular are a real strong factor for your students? Suzanne, I'm just picking up your comment. You were talking about young people worrying that when they feel anxious, they don't feel normal. Why am I so ill? So yeah, the normalizing of anxiety is really important. Absolutely. Tell me on the chat, what do you think of this model? In particular, if you've noticed that being disconnected from any of these factors has made either yourselves or colleagues or young people feeling low. I think a really strong one is, just being disconnected from other people, isn't it? Just, not having those little incidental conversations with people that you might see at work, or just being able to check in with family. What are people's reflections on this model when we think about low mood or depression? For those of you who are working with school staff, so supporting school staff, is there anything within this model that you connect with or recognise? Yes. The disconnect from other people, again, just is coming across really strongly. And I guess the importance of this model is just to remind people that if you're feeling low because you're disconnected, it's okay. And there might be things that we're going to talk about shortly that you can try to connect with to support you with that. Okay, so that's the psychology of anxiety and low mood. That's what we're talking about. And I'm hearing that you're hearing that it's important to talk about these things with young people. What I'm going to share with you now is several tools that you can use to work with children and young people in understanding and managing anxiety and low mood. So I'm going to present them to you. We had a bit of a think about this when we were planning the webinar, because we wondered whether we should look at one tool in particular in detail, have a sort of a workshop and give you an opportunity to practice it in depth, or whether we should give you sort of an overview of a toolkit, different things that you could dip in and out of, tell you where you can find out more. And we decided on this in the end because, you guys are leading and supporting mental health in your school. So we thought you would prefer to know, everything that's out there. The importance of that links back to how we were talking about different young people and adults experience anxiety and low mood differently. So different things might work for different people. Okay, so the things we're going to talk about are the look, listen and link model, relationship-based approaches. We're going to talk about CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy approaches to understanding feelings. And then we're going to talk about some strategies which are called laddering and scaling. I'll explain how they work when we talk about them, and also focus on the key things about relaxation activities and breathing. Okay, so I guess from the things that you've been sharing already so far, a lot of this will be familiar to you. So as we go through, please share examples where you've used any of these tools, or any comments if you find things are new to you and you think they're going to be helpful. Right. So we will go through these probably for about half an hour, and then I'll give you a chance in small groups to reflect and talk about them. Okay. So linking back to the fact that we are disconnected from people and the fact that relationships and connection is a really key protective factor for recovery. This model comes from psychologically informed first aid. And it's just a helpful model for us to remember, for us to think about how we can connect with people. So look, listen, and link. So look for signs of distress, listen, and sometimes listening, even for a short time, can make things better in the short term. Sometimes listening is all we have to do, especially in situations where there's no answers. The situation is really difficult. Sometimes people just want to feel listened to. And link. So link the person to sources of support within their own network or within support services like those we're going to talk to you about today. So the power of listening really is underestimated, I think, within counselling services. So, and those who use counselling type approaches in their work, like most of you who are working in schools. So a psychologist called Órlaith did some research looking at children's views on different types of talking therapy. And he found that no matter what the different model used was, the most common factor that children said was helpful was feeling listened to. So all of us can listen, can't we? So I guess the key thing is this helpful graphic from a lady called Dr. Karen Treisman, who does some really wonderful graphics on key psychology ideas, particularly in the area of anxiety, trauma, low mood, some of these really difficult life experiences. So every moment and interaction can be an intervention in itself. So every conversation that we have with children and young people, with parents, with colleagues, is an opportunity for us to listen, to be a listening ear, to connect, to be an intervention in itself. And I guess it's just a reminder that the little things that we're doing every day are helping, even though they are hard to do within the restrictions. In terms of look, there's two helpful resources, one for anxiety and one for low mood, of things that you should look out for. So these might be useful for you to share with other colleagues within your pastoral teams, within your support teams. So in terms of things to look out for, an example for anxiety is someone who's avoiding things linked to their fears. There's several different things. Within low mood, you might notice that someone becomes quiet and withdrawn. I guess the key thing we need to remember is we need to keep the current context in mind when we're looking out for these things. For example, if you've got someone who has poor attendance at the moment, we've got to think about the wider context. And if they're self-isolating, let's say because of track and trace, then the poor attendance might not necessarily be linked to low mood. So keep the bigger picture in mind when we look for some of these things. And the key things to think about are if anyone, children, adults, young people, are showing too many of these problems for too long with too wide an impact. So if things are persisting, if they're happening, over time, over weeks, over months, and if they're happening in various different places, if we're seeing them in school, if we're seeing them at home, if we're seeing them with friends. So these might be useful in terms of things to look for. In terms of listening, I wanted to draw your attention to some young people voice research, which can tell us, what young people are saying about mental health and also about COVID. So there's a really great report that I wanted to draw your attention to, just published in May, which is a group of young people who did some research on young people's views exploring mental health in Nottingham. And they developed these fantastic resources. So you can download these for free from our project website. You can use them in schools. And these are young people who've used mental health services in Nottinghamshire. And they've developed these posters, and they want them to be displayed in schools and youth centres, etc., to challenge misconceptions around things like anxiety and low mood, and also to share the faces of real people who have experienced these things. So in these posters, you've got this these people, the hashtag real people, making a statement to make people think, and there's also links to different services that children can access. So I would definitely recommend that you download these posters, have a look and see if they might be useful to display in different parts of your schools. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting is a report from Barnardo's where they spoke to over 100 young people. And this was after the first lockdown. They talked about what kept them well. So Suzanne, you were talking about positivity and strength-based approaches. This links really well to that. So asking the question, what kept you well before? That's really tapping into children's resilience. So if you look at some of these things, these are the responses that young people shared. And actually, they really reflect those factors that Johann Hari talks about. Spending time with family, staying connected with friends, spending time with pets. They're also really simple day-to-day things that people can do quite easily. And sometimes I guess we forget the power of these things to help us to feel less anxious or to feel less low. So this is really powerful. This is what young people are telling us helped them to stay well. And this might be useful to share with your young people and ask them, do any of these help them to keep well? And you can really hear those echoes of people rebuilding connections with some of these things if they're feeling low, for example. Okay. So any reflections on the young people's views or in general the importance of listening? Rachel's popped in the chat a link to the posters on the schools portal. That's great. Thanks, Rachel. Any reflections on these pupil views that have been shared, or any examples of things that you think demonstrate the importance of listening to young people? Pop them on the chat and be really useful. It'd be really good to hear your reflections. I'll keep an eye out for them. Okay, so in terms of the look, listen and link approach, the listening is really powerful. If any of you have ELSAs in your schools or you work with ELSAs, or any counsellors that you have, they'll be trained in the art of active listening. And that is always the first step when building that therapeutic relationship. Lovely. Rachel is on the ball. She's also popped a link to that Barnardo's report in the chat. Thanks so much, Rachel. Okay, so essentially what we're talking about here is relationship-based approaches, and reinforcing relationships is really important to let recovery take place. An evidence-based approach which schools can use on a practical level is emotion coaching. Now, some schools in Nottinghamshire and services are using emotion coaching in their work, which is great. We're also in the process of setting up some free emotion coaching training for schools in the spring term. It's going to be funded by services within the family service. So if you keep an eye on the project website, if you don't already use emotion coaching and you're interested in accessing some training, that will be happening in the spring term. So emotion coaching is an approach for adults working with young people to develop relationships, to help them to understand emotions and to solve problems. And I'm going to play this video where someone can explain it much better than me with pictures as well. So you've got a break from hearing my voice. So this is what emotion coaching is. And if you have any reflections on your use of it, please pop them in the chat. And if you're interested in accessing training, those sessions will be happening in the spring. Okay.
Emotion coaching. Emotion coaching is an approach which focuses on the development of emotional regulation through supportive relationships. Children, young people, parents and professionals can all benefit from using emotion coaching. All emotions are innate, meaning we all have them, but that doesn't mean we can manage our emotions easily. We learn to understand and regulate our emotions through our relationships with others. Sometimes we experience emotions in a very big way, making it more difficult for us to process how we are feeling. For example, Charlie is feeling really sad because she is not being listened to. We all feel sad, angry or frustrated sometimes, but Charlie is still learning how to manage these big feelings. Dan Siegel suggests that the brain is like a house, with an upstairs and downstairs. The upstairs brain is more complex and is where we learn, process language and develop problem-solving and decision-making skills. With experience, problem-solving skills are refined, but the upstairs brain isn't fully formed until our mid-20s. The downstairs brain is responsible for breathing and impulsive reactions to strong emotions, like the fight, flight or freeze response. Sometimes, when Charlie experiences very big emotions, she stays in the downstairs brain. On these occasions, she might act on the impulses she has, without thinking through the consequences. Before Charlie can understand and process these emotions, she needs support from a trusted adult, such as a parent, carer, or teacher. Once Charlie feels safe and calm, she can then be supported to move to the upstairs brain. Emotion coaching supports Charlie to be able to move from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain through a process of co-regulation. Co-regulation is when a trusted adult is able to make a connection with Charlie and support her to feel safe, and this can help her to learn to manage these big feelings. Emotion coaching strengthens relationships through increased understanding and empathy. It is essential that the adult connects with the child's emotions rather than judging the child's reasons for feeling this way. This is achieved by the adult connecting with the child before correcting the behaviour. Emotion coaching has 5 key steps. 1. Notice the child's behaviour and tune in to the emotion beneath. 2. Connect with the child and recognise emotional times as opportunities for intimacy and teaching. 3. Listen empathetically and validate the child's feelings. 4. Help the child to verbally label emotions. 5. Set limits on the child's behaviour whilst helping the child to problem solve. There are a number of potential benefits to using emotion coaching. These include supporting children to regulate their emotions, promoting positive relationships between adults and children, increasing academic attainment, and helping adults to feel empowered to manage children's behaviour. If you think you could benefit from emotion coaching.
Okay. So, what are people's reflections on emotion coaching? What do you think? Is anyone using it? Is anyone interested in finding out more? Interesting, Alison. So you're talking about your experience working with young people who've been excluded from school. They talk a lot about saying that they weren't listened to. And yeah, and in young people often as well, we'll talk about if I meet a young person and I ask them, you know, who's really helps you in school, who's someone that helps you, they'll always talk about someone and they'll say they get me or they listen to me. So really young people value the process of being listened to. Lovely. So Suzanne's interested in learning more, which is great. And so if you watch the Wellbeing for Education Return Project website, dates will be coming out for the spring term where we'll be delivering training. Okay, so within Nottinghamshire, we use 4 steps for emotion coaching. And so our training will be looking at that a bit more. And essentially, absolutely. And actually, Alison, it's really interesting as well to know that just the situation at the moment is making it hard to find that space to listen, isn't it? Absolutely. So even, you know, if I've got some else's we were talking to last week where they were saying they're only able to work with young people in their bubble at the moment, but some of their young people they need to work with, they haven't got the space or they're not allowed to work with them. Absolutely. Yeah. And Bev, you're talking about emotion coaching. Brilliant. Yeah. And time. Yeah, absolutely. The time for listening can be challenging, can't it? But actually, if we can find some space to help children feel listened to, then potentially we can save time later on in managing some of the fallout. Absolutely. Yeah. Fabulous. Thanks for your reflections, everybody. Okay, so we've been talking about the power of listening, and we've been talking about relationship-based approaches. Let's think a little bit more now about helping children and teaching young people how to understand feelings, in particular anxiety and low mood. And actually, Alison, you mentioned in the chat there about some people sometimes not being in the right position, not being in the right space to be able to talk or to be able to listen. And so actually for some children, diving in with the teaching of feelings might be too early. And for some children, we might just need to listen to where they are. For other children, they might not want to talk about what's happening for them. They might want to learn just about anxiety in general and then talk about themselves. So as we go through this toolkit, you know, there's no one way that works for everybody. So it's all about getting to know the young person and trying to figure out what's the best way to proceed in the current situation. Okay. Excuse me. So a couple more slides from the slideshow that I talked to you about at the start that you can use for Key Stage 3 to 5 students to teach them about anxiety, how they can understand their anxiety better. Okay, so there's some, when you access these slides as well, there's notes in the bottom for you as the presenter. So there's explanation of the slides if you want to use them. So we talk a lot in this presentation about a CBT model, cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is the essence of CBT, the thoughts, feelings, behavior triangle, or the CBT triangle. This is what CBT is basically, teaching people that feelings, behavior, and thoughts are separate things, but they all impact each other. So feelings create behavior, behavior reinforces thoughts, and thoughts create feelings, and it all goes round. And so if we want to change our behavior or our thoughts, that's where we focus. The key message within CBT is that all feelings are okay. It's okay to have any feeling. It's what we do with them that matters. So the things we want to change is the behavior and the thoughts, but the feelings are part of life, okay? And some ways to do this is particularly to focus on thinking styles. Now, in particular, teenagers are able to access this level focusing on the thoughts and spotting unhelpful thinking styles. But actually, this might be useful as well for adults who are experiencing anxiety at the moment to try and spot if we're having any of these unhelpful thinking styles. So what tends to happen when we feel anxious, because the thinking part of our brain doesn't work so well, is we start to have these unhelpful thinking styles. For example, catastrophizing, blowing things out of proportion, or jumping to conclusions, or mind reading, imagining that we know what others are thinking. Does anybody recognize any of these unhelpful thinking styles? Have you noticed them in young people you work with or in yourselves? So Suzanne, you were talking about focusing on positives and strengths. And actually that is a really effective strategy for the unhelpful thinking style of filtering, which is about filtering out the good and just focusing on, you know, the negative things and paying attention to the bad. And we tend to do that when we feel anxious. So having sort of a positive approach and focusing on strengths really helps with that. Any of these thinking styles people recognize or want to comment on? Just pop a comment in the chat. And I'll share with you, as you're reflecting, how we can overcome them. So these two slides go together for young people. The first is identifying and noticing it. So teaching young people about these unhelpful thinking styles. And then for each one, they might start to think of examples and they might start to notice which ones they experience. Challenge it, rewrite it. And for some children, they might not be able to challenge their thoughts, but they might be able to distract themselves. So if they have an unhelpful thought, so for example, if they've got a test, it's just a very practical example, catastrophizing might be, I'm going to fail, I'm going to get everything wrong, it's going to be a disaster. And actually what we can do is we can notice that thought and we can try and rewrite it into a more helpful thought, like I've studied hard. Yeah. And so Suzanne, you're recognizing the catastrophizing occurs all the time. Absolutely. So the first step is identifying it and helping the young people to notice that that is happening in their thoughts. And if we can notice it, then we can challenge it and rewrite it. And for some people, even writing it down and rewriting it as a helpful thought can be really useful. Okay, so these are slides that you can share with young people to facilitate that activity. This is really powerful as well. I think particularly for those of us as adults in schools. So as staff, as professionals, as parents and carers, this is a really useful graphic to help us to separate out the things we can control and the things we can't control. So we can't control things like if other people follow the rules of social distancing. So I can let go of these things, and I can control my positive attitude, watching less news, for example. And then we can think about practical things we can do to help us manage anxiety at the moment. So this is a really useful graphic and useful to share, I think, as well with the adults in our schools. Finally, in terms of thinking about our thoughts and rewriting and managing our thoughts, this activity sometimes works well for young people who will struggle to talk about their own thoughts and feelings. They will struggle to challenge their own thoughts, but they would be able to tell their friend or give advice to their friend. So a sort of a thought experiment with a young person is, what might you say to your friend if they were having this problem? Or if they were having these worries, what advice might you give your friend? So asking that question sometimes creates a bit of distance and helps young people to feel like they could start to explore what's going on. Okay, so that's the CBT approach to teaching about emotions and sharing. Let me go back to this. So this is about sharing the CBT triangle and particular focusing on thoughts. And these are some really useful resources to share with young people and explore with them about what they notice, to find if different activities might work for them. And again, remembering different things will work for young people. Okay. The next thing in our toolkit is things that you might do at a one-to-one level. So some of those resources that we just shared, you might do with groups, or you might do, let's say, in tutor time, or if you have a small group. Whereas scaling and laddering would often be for one-to-one work with children. So if you were supporting someone one-to-one, these might be things you can look at. And essentially, scaling and laddering are activities that we can use to help people to face their fears. So this model shows us that the more we face our fears, the less the fear gets. So when we think about facing a scary thing, let's say if we're afraid of spiders, thinking about spiders might make us feel a high level of fear. But if we face a spider and then we do it again, the level of fear gets less every time. And I think that's really important when talking with young people about doing something that they're worried about, helping them to know that the first time you try it, it might be really hard. You might have a really tough time, but you've got someone with you supporting you. And the more you try it, the less anxiety you will feel over time. And I think that's quite a powerful visual to demonstrate that, isn't it? So scaling and laddering are tools then that we can do to start setting some goals to move towards doing the things that we're worried about. So scaling is a solution-focused strategy which asks children and young people, that's CYP, to rate their anxiety about a particular situation on a scale of 0 to 10, and then set small steps to reduce their anxiety. Okay, so what we're going to give you for each one of these tools is a worked example and then a blank worksheet that you can use with children and young people. And basically we would ask children, how much anxiety do you feel about something? This example is about going to a lesson with an unfamiliar supply teacher. So if they're at 10, they're feeling very high levels of anxiety. And if they're at 0, they're not feeling any anxiety at all. The key thing about scaling is wherever the young person is on the scale, we talk to them about just moving one step down the scale. So it's all about small steps. So if going into a lesson with an unfamiliar supply teacher makes you feel anxiety at level 9, what could you do to go to level 8? It's all about taking small steps. Children could have multiple scales. They could have a scale about getting the bus, they could have a scale about eating their lunch, they could have a scale about anything that they're worried about. And they can help them to set small step goals to move down the scale gradually. And actually, what this is doing, linking back to some of the psychology we talked about earlier, is trying to break down the overwhelming nature of anxiety, where you just feel in the fight, flight, freeze zone, you can't think, you can't move. This is making it concrete and it's breaking it down. The second strategy is laddering. And if a young person is completely overwhelmed by anxiety, it's really useful to start with scaling, because scaling is just about trying to reduce anxiety. Whereas laddering is about then moving towards the thing you're worried about. So what we would do is put the thing you're worried about at the top of the ladder, you're at the bottom, and what are the steps moving towards going up towards it? An example, again, the same example is worked through for you in these slides, going into a lesson with an unfamiliar supply teacher. And so you might do things bit by bit. So you might do walking into the lesson, you might do talking about the lesson, you might get your stuff ready for the lesson, you might sit outside the lesson and listen, you might go in for a short time and come out, you might go in with a trusted TA. So these tools are things that you could do over several sessions with a young person. So I'm interested to hear, if you want to pop your reflections on the chat, what situations do you think your students would find laddering and scaling useful for? So any examples where you think, that situation I could use scaling, or that situation I could use laddering. In the webinar I was in yesterday, one of the people on the webinar was talking about how their staff are feeling very anxious about working virtually. So they were talking about using laddering to do online training and to manage the technology. They were talking about how some of their staff might be able to use laddering. And I thought that was really useful as well, to point out that some of these things can be useful for adults as well. Okay, so yeah, any examples? What do you think your students would find laddering and scaling useful for? Any examples that you think, just pop them in the chat, that'd be great. Lovely. So Suzanne, actually, the example, you know, going into a lesson for your young person, going into a French lesson, not knowing why, but feeling very anxious, laddering would be very useful, wasn't it? Yeah, so going into the lesson, be at the top of the ladder, and you don't have to start by going straight in. You can have these small steps towards it. Lovely. Okay. So the final tool, before I give you guys a chance to talk to each other and reflect, is relaxation and breathing. Now, there are loads of different relaxation and breathing activities. Oh, a couple more. Sorry, I'm moving on too quickly. Joe, going into exams. You think, yeah, laddering would definitely help with exams as well. Yeah. You know, you could be getting your stuff ready, doing your study, going into the exam, and focusing on having a drink with you, all the different little steps. Absolutely. Thanks very much for sharing your examples. So the final tool I'm going to talk to you about is relaxation and breathing. And there's loads of resources, and we can signpost you to things. But I guess the key message around relaxation and breathing is for young people to understand that what we're trying to do is get the relaxation response when our body is feeling fight, flight, or freeze. And when we start to do things like breathing exercises, relaxation exercises, the first time we use them, they probably don't work very well. And actually, we need to practice them to make them stronger in the face of shortness of breath, you know, high heart rate. I'm sure lots of you have worked with children. If you ask them about relaxation and breathing, and they might say things like, oh yeah, you know, take deep breaths. Oh, I tried that, it doesn't work. And actually, it's really important to talk about that with young people, to say the first few times that you try it, it might not work to make you feel less anxious. And actually, you need to build in practice to make it work when you need it. So really interesting to think at the moment where we're building in practice for these new skills like relaxation and breathing. Okay, so that is a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to stop sharing and give you guys a chance to reflect with each other, okay? So that's a whistle-stop tour of the things we're talking about. What I'm going to do, just for 10 minutes, is I'm going to invite you to join a breakout room, okay? So I'll pause the recording. Re-record. Any questions or comments that people wanted to share on the chat while we're all back together? Anything in particular that people wanted to share?
I've unmiked myself,
Brilliant.
unmuted myself. Sue Chappell, I can't, for whatever reason, chat. I can't, it won't let me type, it won't let me do anything.
Tell us in real life, Sue. Speak to us.
I've just been in the chat room with Kelly and Tracy Ayres. Tracy Ayres is my line manager, and I've just said that these presentations are really good because they sort of reconfirm that I'm doing things right. That's what it gives me, because sometimes you get in a situation with parents and students, because I work with the excluded children in the north of the county. And sometimes when you're working from home and you get a phone call and you do take it, and then you think, crikey, was that correct or not? So watching this, it really helps me to reflect back and realise that, yeah, I'm doing the practice okay.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
I would have put it in chat, but I can't get in it.
Oh, that's great, Sue. That's really good to hear, because that is a real strong message that I really want to get across as part of this project, that, you know, it's the same stuff that we know about in terms of well-being, because it's a strange situation, and actually just to remind and reassure ourselves that we should still be talking about feelings.
Obviously, I talk to Tracy, my line manager, daily, several times a day, reflect on this, and I've said, I've done this, is this correct, I've done that, but seeing it actually on a screen, a visual for me, has really reinforced it. So thank you.
Great. Oh, thanks, Sue. Are there any other reflections from any of the breakout rooms that people wanted to share before we finish up? Any comments? Any examples? Right, if you're not feeling too brave, you can pop it in the chat. Lovely. Yes, oh, that's great, Suzanne. That's really great to hear that you're finding the content helpful to support not only your students, but also yourselves and families. That's great, and that's a really strong message we wanted to